Hi everybody, welcome indeed to this revision webcast. And this evening what we're going to be looking at is evaluation skills. This just has to be one of the big questions that students keep asking me. They say, look, Geoff, I know my stuff, I'm really good at theory, I can draw diagrams in my sleep, I'm pretty good at handling data, but I really struggle with evaluation. What can I do? How can I get better evaluation marks? And the answer that I always give to that question is, I don't know. I haven't got a clue. No, seriously, I do have a clue. I do have some ideas. And in this revision session, just the next 15, 20 minutes or so, what I thought I'd do is take you through some of my favorite evaluation approaches, some good phrases to use, all in the context of one or two exam-style questions where you can bring your evaluation argument into play. Okay? Here's just briefly, before we look at some examples of the questions that I've chosen, here are some evaluation questions from past papers that require this kind of approach. So students taking Edexcel board, you know that in the micro paper, you're going to get two 14-mark evaluation questions. There's also an examiner question worth 10 marks, but here were the 14 markers. Certainly knowing for my own students the pressure they're under right at the end of the exam. They've done their multiple choice, they've done their analysis questions, working hard on a paper. They've got to get their timing right to give themselves enough leeway to answer two 14-mark evaluation questions. So just recently had a question on potash. Discuss the case for allowing a potash mining to go ahead in the North Yorkshire Moors. Discuss the factors that might influence the supply of labour to the mining industry or any other industry of your choice. Those were two evaluation questions. There was also a question on bottled water. Discuss the possible economic effects of increased production and consumption. And a slightly different question, evaluate the likely economic effects of an increase in indirect tax on bottled water. They even give you a steer there. Do you see that right at the bottom? You use supply and demand diagram in your answer. But of course you were going to use one anyway. So why did they ask you that? Anyway, it doesn't matter. Here are two more Edexcel questions, both 14 markers, both requiring evaluation. Discuss the factors that might influence the supply of labour. Evaluate two measures by which the government could promote the generation of renewable energy. Very clear steer there in that second question. Evaluate two measures. So identify what those measures are, analyse them, and evaluate them. And then a really popular question. Whenever you ask a question about cigarettes, every student seems to know everything there is to know about cigarettes. Don't know why, but discuss the likely benefits to consumers and the government of a decrease in smoking. And a slightly different evaluation question there, do you see that one? To what extent might regulations on the sale of cigarettes, things like a smoking ban, and high taxes result in government failure? So those are the style of 14-mark questions that, for example, the Edexcel board are asking. Just briefly, AQA do something slightly different. They have a 25-mark question at the end. And oftentimes they ask you to evaluate the arguments for and against something. It requires a slightly different approach. In this case, arguments for and against the government intervening to prevent farmers giving over their land to produce biofuel instead of crops for food, for example. Now, another question on the same paper looked at the newspaper market. And again, the command words are the same. Using the data and your own knowledge, evaluate the case for and against subsidizing newspapers and online news. Now, every board is different. Okay, so every exam board has a different mark scheme and a different criteria for gathering together those evaluation marks. And in this brief webcast, I'm not going to take you through the minutiae of every single board. We may have time to do that in future webcasts ahead of the exam. But what I thought I'd do instead, without losing any relevance to anybody in the audience, is think about an evaluation approach. Think about the phrases and the techniques and the tactics that are going to score well on evaluation, regardless of the board that you take. So what I've taken here, just for the next 5 minutes or so, is a topic close to everybody's heart, the question of fast food and a kind of continuing debate about what can we do to combat obesity, what can we do to combat allegedly excessive consumption of high-fat fast foods. But here's the question. Assess the effectiveness of a new indirect tax on fast food in improving the health of young people in Britain. Again, in yellow there, I've underlined it, put it in bold, the effectiveness of something. So clearly we have an intervention here in the market, an indirect tax. Does it work? How effective is it likely to be? So let's have a look. It's a 14 market. If it was an Edexcel paper, you'd be trying to get 14 marks here. And my really strong advice, particularly if you're taking the Edexcel board, is to get those KAA marks nailed straight away. No messing, no waffle, no padding. Nail it, okay? Get the knowledge, application, and analysis marks straight away. Those of you who've been in my webinars before know that I like to define key terms in a question, in this case, indirect tax. Then I like to build my analysis, showing, for example, a tax in a market using an analysis diagram to illustrate it. And you can gather up to 4 marks just for doing that, if it's accurate. Then just develop the explanations. What's the effect on the demand? What's the effect on the impact on health, for example, weight levels, obesity risk, that kind of stuff, okay? You can get up to 8 marks for KAA, literally, without thinking, okay? It's providing you've got the good understanding, the good knowledge, the good diagrams ready to roll. Massively important point, everybody, analysis comes before evaluation, okay? You wouldn't start a meal with a sweet and finish with a starter. Absolutely, you might do, but anyway, normally you wouldn't do that, okay? Analysis comes before evaluation. As soon as that clock is ticking, as soon as you've chosen your question, nail the early parts of the question really well. Then build analysis. So here we go. I'm going to take you through some ideas and some suggestions for evaluation. Those of you who've been in the webinars before will know that I adopt a color-coded approach sometimes to answers. I use orange when I'm using knowledge. I use light blue when I'm trying to apply the data or the evidence that's provided. I use purple for analysis, and I use green when I'm trying to evaluate. Now, please, in the exam, don't use colored pens. It's just purely for revision purposes. But let's start building the evaluation arguments. One approach is to say, well, actually, the effectiveness depends. It depends on elasticity. In fact, some students have this as kind of default evaluation. It depends on elasticity. Sadly, some of them leave it there. They don't even take any time and trouble to develop it. But I've taken the time. Effectiveness depends on price elasticity, right? Fine, good point. Extract 2, I've made that up by the way, suggests that the elasticity demand for hamburgers is minus 1.5. No, it was 1.5. This shows that 20% rise in price could lead to a 30% reduction in consumption. Okay, just using a bit of number crunching. You don't need double maths for that. Other policies might not be effective as this. And that would be worth a couple of marks. That's just using, it depends on the elasticity. Here's a value from the extract. I can work out a number. 30% fall in consumption. Well, what's going to be as effective as that? That's an evaluation argument. I get a couple of marks quite easily. Of course, you can then nail it with a diagram. So I'm suggesting here that if the demand for high-fat foods, like a burger, fish and chips, is elastic, if consumers are price sensitive, then a tax would be quite effective in reducing demand. Here from Q1 to Q2, we move up the demand curve as the tax is imposed and the price goes up from P1 to P2. So I could nail, that would be my analysis diagram. That would be my 4 marks to show an analysis diagram there. Okay, second approach would be to challenge the effectiveness. So my first approach is actually this tax could be very effective. Okay, use the elasticity. Oh, by the way, evaluation doesn't just mean being critical of something. It doesn't just mean it might not work. Sometimes evaluation is saying, actually, yes, I think this policy can work. I think a tax on high-fat food can work. I think a congestion charge in London can make a serious dent in traffic congestion. I think a carbon tax can cut emissions. And this is why I think this. Okay? Evaluation doesn't just mean saying, oh, it's not going to work. You can actually say, no, it could actually work really well, and this is why. But the second point is actually to challenge the effectiveness. So you go to the idea that young people are addicted to Nando's, or they're addicted to Mackie D's on the way home from school, and it doesn't really matter what tax you impose, particularly people who've got habitual consumption or people with very high incomes. They're just going to continue to consume despite the tax. Now, that's a simple evaluation argument. It's not particularly high level. It's worth a couple of marks. You can nail that particular point if you had a diagram showing a much more inelastic demand. Okay, so you don't have to draw two diagrams. One is absolutely fine. But in this case, here's our diagram. Inelastic demand. Can you see the effect of the tax there? Supply curve shifts upwards. Price goes up to P2. Most of that tax is paid by the consumer. Producer absorbed a little bit. Most importantly, the quantity only falls from Q1 to Q2. It looks as if the tax in this case isn't particularly effective. It'll be challenging the effectiveness of a policy. That is evaluation. Another way you can evaluate is my third point, and that is to question the definition. This is a subtle form of evaluation, but actually it could be quite a convincing one, particularly with examiners who know their stuff. Have a look at point 3 here. Notice in orange I'm putting in a couple of examples, and I'll come back to that in a second. So here's point 3. The case for tax depends on, valuation phrase, on what we count as fast food. So it's a definition question. Well, what is fast food? Is Nando's fast food? Is getting some porridge from Pret fast food? If somebody can make you a sandwich really quickly, is that fast food? Okay. It depends on the definition. Okay, and not all fast food is unhealthy. Okay, so food on the go meals, lots of low value, low calorific, low fat options around for consumers, lots of healthy meals. So challenging the definition of the product in the question is a good way of evaluating. Notice what I've done here in point 3 to nail an extra evaluation point. So not all fast food is unhealthy, such as fruit and food on the go meals, such as porridge and soup. By the way, porridge, I'm not just putting in to stir things up, but that's an actual point. What is included will depend on, that's an evaluation phrase, will depend on the government making value judgments. That's a key phrase, because nearly always with these kind of interventions, you can't avoid making value judgments. Sort of paternalistic approach of the government. That can add extra depth to evaluation point. So far we've done 3 approaches. Hopefully maybe 1 or 2 of those might work for you. How about an alternative approach? Well, the alternative is to suggest alternatives. Okay, so we're told to evaluate the effectiveness of an indirect tax. Fine, you can challenge the question there and what have you, but what if the market failure isn't actually about the price? What if it's just basically an information failure? What if young people don't understand what they're eating when they go into KFC? Okay, it could be an information issue, and the classic example there is when people overconsume a demerit good. Okay, so I've put in demerit good and market failure to score some knowledge marks. That's built into my evaluation. Here we go. If the main market failure is an information failure, i.e. overconsumption of demerit goods, then informing consumers about the harmful long-term effects might be more effective as a tax. I go back to the question. And crucially in there, everybody, I'm putting long-term effects in there. I'm thinking in a slightly different time frame. So recognizing alternative policies, suggest alternative policies. So this, to my mind, is one of the best approaches to evaluation. Think about alternatives to the intervention you're being asked to discuss. More effective policy might be to invest in and subsidize sporting facilities for young people. Okay. Also, notice in point 5, the phrasing I'm using here. A more effective policy might be, not is, not will be, not must, but might be. I'm just giving a little bit of doubt, openness in my phrasing, because of course you can challenge that as well as part of the evaluation. Quantifying something is quite important. Okay, so how big is the scale of something? 20% tax on fast foods would probably be effective, rather than a 5% tax, because that's most of the people hit are those who consume fast food quite frequently. They spend a high percentage of their income on the product. That would suggest demand would be much more elastic. That's an evaluation point. And here's another evaluation approach. It's to consider equity issues. Now, the Edexcel board in particular, very, very keen that when you get a question on government intervention in markets, you do consider as part of the evaluation who the winners are and who are the losers, and are there implications for the distribution of income across society. So what's the point I'm making here? There's a risk. I'm not saying that it's going to happen. I'm saying there is a risk that a new tax on fast foods would hurt poorer families most, leading to a rise in inequality. So what I'm trying to do here is just build some approaches to evaluation. There's more than one way to skin a cat, and you don't have to put all of these in, just looking for 2 or 3 effective approaches to the question. So on our fast food evaluation question, what are my key takeaway points? The first is, when you get a policy intervention or a proposal, be prepared to critically assess it. Don't take it at face value. Do the analysis first, but be prepared to be critical of the policy. Use the extract material. Now, this is incredibly important in the exam that you may be taking in just a few days' time. The data, and the evidence, and the arguments in the extracts provided are there to help you. So good application helps evaluation. Oftentimes you can make an evaluation point and support it with a bit of evidence, either from the extracts or your own knowledge. So the extract material is there to give you clues. Some of the answers, some of the suggestions, some of the steers are in the extracts. And that's why in the exam it's always worth spending 5 minutes working your way through the extracts with a highlighter pen or a different coloured pen or pencil, and really working the information, thinking, right, where am I going to be able to use this in the questions that lie ahead. Crucially, don't neglect the charts and the diagrams. Okay, a lot of students, when they're looking to evaluate and build good answers, they focus disproportionately on the text in an answer. It's almost as if their eyes are driven to text and their minds tend to ignore charts and tables. They are there for a reason, and you should be using every extract throughout the course of your answer. Okay, as I often say to my own students, this is a data response paper, not a data ignore paper. And so many students don't use the data in the charts and the tables and the diagrams. Please do that. Crucially, I think the best candidates in evaluation, they kind of calibrate their answers. They can kind of, as they're writing, as they're thinking, think, well, actually, this argument might be stronger than this one. This argument I might leave to the end because it's kind of more pertinent to the question, so the kind of argument I want to finish with. Okay. So this question was about effectiveness of fast food. So you might have 2 or 3 arguments you want to put in there. And you're kind of thinking all the time, right, it's a bit like the final round of pointless. You might leave your best point till the end in the hope of getting a pointless answer. You might leave your best argument to the end in the exam in the hope of getting loads of points for your answer. Crucially, and this is thinking slightly left field here, a lot of questions ask, should the government intervene to do this? Should the government tax, subsidize, put a maximum price in, all that kind of stuff? Okay? You don't have to intervene in a market. You don't have to intervene. Consider, for example, what might happen if there's no intervention. Will the market provide a solution to something? For example, carbon emissions. Or, if you don't intervene, could the problem get even worse in the long term? So that's an evaluation approach. Think about what might happen if the government doesn't have the courage of its convictions and make an intervention in a particular market. And crucially, this is really important, evaluation flows well if you know your stuff and if you're smart and savvy in the pressure and the tension of the exam hall. Please, please don't go on to autopilot. Look carefully at the extracts and the case studies and the issues you're presented with. You've been taught the theory, you've been taught the ideas, and hopefully you've practiced your evaluation skills. So be really clever and smart and clean in the exam about how you actually use this kind of stuff you've been taught. Don't just answer the question you want to come up. Answer the question that actually appears on the paper. Now, here are a few evaluation phrases, and if I see some of these when I'm marking papers in the summer, I know you've been listening to this webcast. Okay, these are quite useful evaluation phrases. There's many more than I've listed here. Let me just pick out 1 or 2 for you. So the impact depends on. Straight away, that kind of phrasing leads you into kind of the evaluative approach. In the short run, this might happen, but in the long run, this might happen. Short run, long run distinction, always a favourite for students who want to evaluate. I like this next one. The most significant effect is likely to be, or the most significant benefit is likely to be, perhaps the most significant cost. Whenever you use the word most significant, the word's there, you're calibrating, you're weighing up the arguments. Okay, so last two are a little bit longer, but I think great evaluation phrases. Given the evidence I've used, by the way, don't write that down if you haven't used any evidence, but given the evidence I've used, I would argue that the best solution in the circumstances is X, Y, Z. Okay? That leads you into a kind of final reasoned comment, if you like. This last one is the Uber of evaluation phrases. It is the best evaluation phrase the world has ever seen. Maybe that's exaggerating a little bit, but let's take you through it. This is a complex problem and requires a combination of policies to make a big difference in the long run. Complexity, you need more than one policy to make a significant difference, and you've got to think long term instead of short term. Now, you can use that phrase if you want, but if you do, please acknowledge it in the exam and send me £10. But what I'm suggesting is that this is a kind of phrase that leads into good evaluation, particularly if you're able to articulate what those policies might be and why they might make a difference in the long run. Now, I hope that some of those phrases might be useful for you. Now, one of the issues is what kind of words to use which help the evaluation flow without being kind of mechanistic about it. In our revision workshops this spring across the UK, thousands of students have come to these events, and we've been using the idea of connective words. These are short words which just provide a little bit of the glue. Actually, they provide a bit of the flow when you're writing a paragraph. If you look in the second and third columns here, these are what are called some contrasting words and some qualifying words. Now, I've deliberately put them in bold because they're kind of words that help evaluation. And if you can practice evaluation, they will flow a little bit more easily for you in the exam. On the other hand, otherwise, instead of alternatively, however, it depends on, etc., that kind of stuff. Those kind of qualifying and contrasting connective words can just subtly give you an evaluative style on paper. And I'm sure many of you use those words already. If not, have a go. Now, just to finish with, what I thought I'd give you is a little exercise, a little test of your understanding of evaluation. So I'm going to provide you with 2 sample student answers to this question. To what extent should the government subsidise renewable energy? I'm going to provide you with 2 answers. Neither of them are perfect, but I think it just gives you a clue as to where the better answers tend to go in an exam. Here's our first answer. This is student A. And again, at the bottom, here's my color coding approach. Orange for knowledge, light blue for application, purple for analysis, and crucially in this webcast, green for evaluation. So this is student A. It's a paragraph. Subsidy for renewable energy would help reduce negative externalities in the long term. This would mean there would be less pollution, and so many consumers wouldn't suffer as much as they do now. There might, however, be a big opportunity cost in the form of visual pollution, especially for people who live near wind farms and find it hard to sleep at night. Now, assuming you guys are still awake, what do you think about that? What do you think about that answer? Is it a decent answer? Is it the answer you'd expect from an AS student who is taking a microeconomics paper? What's in there for the examiner to wax lyrical about? Well, I reckon it's not bad. Okay, there's some analysis there. The analysis is in purple. Okay, subsidy helps to reduce negative externalities. There's a bit of explanation there. It would mean there's less pollution, so consumers wouldn't suffer. There's a little bit of analysis there, and there is an attempt at evaluation. There might, however, be a big opportunity cost. It's amazing, isn't it, how many students use the concept of opportunity cost? It's a kind of default. Time lags, elasticity, opportunity cost. It's almost as if their teachers tell them, whenever you evaluate, you have to mention time lags, opportunity cost, and elasticity. I wouldn't dream of saying that, okay? But many people do. Anyway, this is a decent answer. What kind of evaluation is it? It's not very high level evaluation. It's not particularly stunning, but there's an attempt to say, look, there's a big opportunity cost, and actually people who live near wind farms are going to suffer from insomnia. Okay? Now, what about this second answer? The really bright ones amongst you will notice this is a longer answer. But longer answers aren't necessarily better answers. Let's go through it. A subsidy is a payment given to a firm to help them reduce the price of a product in order to raise consumption or production. If renewable energy was subsidized, this incentive might help to reduce negative externalities in the long term, as the article states that onshore wind is more environmentally friendly. One way they could raise the revenue for a subsidy is by taxing fossil fuels. However, in the short run, the higher cost of renewables could mean electricity bills are much higher. This would raise the cost of living for consumers, many of whom are on low incomes and at risk of fuel poverty. And this might mean a subsidy is inequitable. I hope you're thinking that answer from student B is better than the answer from student A. I'm hoping you're thinking that, okay? If you're not, Houston, we have a problem. But let's look at it. The student starts off with a good, clean definition. You could improve that definition, I'm sure, but it's not bad. Okay, they know what a subsidy is. They get marks for knowledge. They start to build a little bit of analysis there. Okay, renewable energy was subsidized. The incentive might help reduce externalities. And if there was a diagram there, that would be excellent. I haven't got time to show that, but there could be a diagram there to help you. A little bit of application. As the article states, onshore wind is more environmentally friendly. So they're trying to get some application. One way to raise the money is by taxing a fossil fuel, a carbon tax. Okay, that's some economics there. So, for example, a carbon tax could provide the tax revenues for a significant investment in offshore or onshore solar panels, solar farms, for example. Now, what about the evaluation? Yes, it's there. In the short run, renewables will be more expensive. Analysis could talk about economies of scale there. Bills are higher. It's going to increase the cost of living for consumers, many of whom are on low incomes. So it could be inequitable. So in the short run, the price will be higher, and that could cause a problem for families on low incomes. You could develop the evaluation by saying the government might respond to this by offering a subsidy for consumers of renewable energy, or maybe some sort of welfare cash payment for at-risk households. So one could develop the evaluation, but there is a genuine attempt in this answer to evaluate the question. I think it's a slightly stronger paragraph than the one before, and I hope you kind of agree with me on the basis of that. So just to round off, just to finish off in this session on evaluation, I just want to take you through some generic points about evaluating arguments in the exam. Hopefully some of these will stick, and in the paper itself, you don't have to cover all of these. You're just looking for 2 or 3 evaluative approaches and arguments to nail them off. Firstly, I think evaluation is always better, always stronger, when it's supported by evidence and data. It could be the data in the extracts. It could be evidence and examples from your own knowledge. So please keep reading the newspapers and the topical news stories as they appear. The students who know more stuff nearly always score highly on evaluation because they can support the points they're making. Secondly, be willing to question whether a policy is likely to be effective. As soon as you do that, you're going to be linking to elasticity of demand and or elasticity of supply. That's a good approach because you can almost certainly link to an analysis diagram there. Think about the unintended consequences of a policy. So what might a high tax food do for elated markets, for example? Every policy always has at least one unintended effect, and that of course can raise the risk of government failure. Are there better alternatives to a policy? So if you're given an intervention option, what are the alternatives? Are they better? Have they actually been tried either in the UK or in other countries? Sometimes you can bring in that wider knowledge as well. Who are the winners and losers of an intervention? Is a policy decision fundamentally fair, or does it raise questions, important issues of inequality and access and affordability? If the government doesn't intervene in the market, does it make the market failure deeper? That's an important question. Instead of there being one single policy, really good evaluation talks about combinations of policies to address a problem. You might attack an issue on the demand side, affecting consumers. You might address an issue on the supply side, affecting producers. Maybe together that combination could be more successful. Instead of intervening, can the market provide solutions? Maybe out there in the labs at Google or Tesla, can the market provide effective solutions, providing the government offers the right incentives? Do you always need the state to intervene? And something which is kind of a little bit left field, but students love this kind of stuff, maybe instead of the government intervening through taxes and subsidies and all that kind of stuff, maybe behavioral economics can change people's choices and outcomes. The so-called nudge theory, for example, of getting consumers to change the choices there about what they consume, how they save, all those kind of examples. Here are some generic approaches to evaluation. Hopefully 2 or 3 of them might work for you. Always good to read examiners' reports. I do suggest finally that you can go over to the exam website of the board of study and have a good close look at examiners' reports. I've just picked out finally for you just 2 examples of the examiners saying something about evaluation. Only a minority of responses. That probably means, by the way, 1 person. Only a minority of responses challenged the question and suggested that without intervention, to curb smoking in this case, there will be greater failure in the market. Now look, if the examiners are telling you that, if you are really smart and savvy, and I know you are, because that's why you're listening to this webcast, you want to be thinking, okay, I might use that in my exam next week. I might suggest that intervention isn't necessarily needed, but if they don't intervene, it could be even worse. Here's my last quote from the examiner. I like this one. Some excellent responses arose, which remained focused on the question. That's interesting because if you don't focus on the question, an answer can't be excellent anyway. So, but anyway, let's move on. And offered both economic analysis in the form of good diagrams, you know how important they are, and balanced evaluation, costs and benefits, calibrated and expressed and explained in a reasoned, intelligent way, leaving, for example, politics as much as possible out of the equation. There we go. We've covered in the last half an hour, hopefully lots of issues to do with evaluation in exams. We've looked at some past questions, we've looked at different approaches, and I'm hoping that in your AS micro paper, whenever you take it, that'll just give you a little extra confidence in handling evaluation. If you want to keep the conversation going, follow me on Twitter, tutor2u_econ, or go to our website and download some resources. Thank you for joining me in this session. I look forward to seeing you again sometime.